Hello and welcome back. This is Dr. Swope from Germantown, Maryland. Hope you had a great weekend. Today is Monday, and today we're going to dig into kind of the continuation of development. For much of development, if you look at psychology textbooks in our curriculum, so much of it is disproportionately focused on the young child, infancy, neonativity, and the idea of the growth changes in the first couple years. And that makes sense. But we forget that much of our life is not when we're a young child. So psychology has taken a pretty deep look at that, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so I'm not going to necessarily read all of these bullet points because, as you know, I like to talk a lot, and we're really supposed to wrap this up in 45 minutes. So with the end, I have a couple extra slides towards the end that's going to give you some extra tips to help you out towards the end of the lesson. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're going to do adolescence. We're going to do middle ages, older ages, and not only that, but look at the physical, the different dimensions, the cognitive, social, and the emotional development of human beings as they go through this, and the moral development too. Okay, before we get too deep into what we're going to do today, as you know, we're going to review what we did, what you did on Friday. So hopefully you have your files open that you wrote this out and or piece of paper, because I know you didn't just mentally do it, you actually took the time to write these out. We're back visiting the Schmidlap family. This time, of course, it was little baby Timmy Schmidlap. And we're talking about these 4 vocabulary words and concepts. And I told you on Friday, the hint was which one of these is due to nature, meaning Timmy's efforts all by himself, or nurture, his mother's efforts in his first couple years of life. So let's take a look at this. Proximal distal development, we're going to define it as the idea that babies gain control of their bodies from their torso outwards towards their limbs. And then what we're going to do is we're going to suggest this process would be based on Timmy's efforts. Okay, not his mom's, because you know what the reality is, no matter how good of a parent you are, you cannot affect your child's kind of neurological development. So let me read it here word for word. This process would be based on Timmy's efforts because he would be able to control his torso muscles before he could control his arm muscles. His mom's efforts would not reflect that. Okay, makes sense. Just in case there was any doubt in the AP reader's mind, let's go deeper. Babies roll over before they can crawl. This is according to the idea of maturationism. And remember that word from Friday's lesson. That means they need to gain control of their back and abdominal muscles before they can gain control of their arms and leg muscles. Okay, that makes sense. So another use, you didn't think you'd see the word proximal so often. So let's look at proximal development, the zone of proximal development. The zone of proximal development is the idea that what a child can do with help is more than what a child can do without help. That kind of makes sense. There's the definition. This process is based on Timmy's mother's efforts. So this is more of the nurture idea. With her involvement and support, Timmy would be able to do much more difficult tasks than he could do by himself. Let's go deeper and kind of flex our muscles a little bit. Lev Vygotsky's idea of the zone of proximal development shows that children often don't simply obtain a skill by themselves in one moment. They need the help of a teacher. I put that in quotes because a teacher could be a brother, sister, or mother. It doesn't have to be actually an official teacher. They need help of a teacher. While they are working with a teacher, they are in the zone of proximal development. Okay, got it. Egocentrism is the idea that a young child has difficulty with the idea that others do not know what he knows. And then we're going to apply it. This is, well, let's see, can the mother affect how Johnny, or are we on Timmy? I forget which Schmidlap brother we're on. Egocentrism is the idea of the process that Johnny or Timmy struggles with independent of his mother's thought. He may get frustrated communicating with her because he thinks she should already knows what he knows. And if you've dealt with a very young child trying to explain themselves, part of their frustration is not only do they not have the vocab, but they're looking at you like, well, how do you not know this? I know this. Everyone should know this. That's kind of egocentrism. Another way to say egocentrism is that it is the opposite of the theory of mind. The theory of mind suggests people are aware that other people have knowledge and intentions that are different. Young children struggle with this. Okay, so let's move on. Oh, we got teratogens. We got one more. Okay, and then teratogens can be thought of as prenatal poisons that cross the placental barrier and have a negative effect on the development of a fetus. Okay. Teratogens would be based on the efforts of Timmy's mother. Her ability to control what foods and chemicals she ingests would affect him, but not be in his control. So again, that's going to be more of a nurture situation. The environment is the chemical environment in which he's in. Teratogens are often thought of external substances such as alcohol, drugs, and nicotine, but the mother's own stress hormones, such as cortisol, can have an effect on how the fetus develops. Okay, let's go into today's stuff. Again, like I said at the very beginning, a lot of psychology of development and focus on prenatal, infancy, young children, because the growth there is just ridiculous in terms of physical, mental, social, and all kinds of dimensions, and things happen so very quickly. But that doesn't mean that once you're out of young childhood, we don't develop, we don't change. Of course we do. So we're going to pick up with the idea of adolescence, and let's define it. And I don't know that there's a very hardcore definition. Some people just call it a transition, but we don't want to just say it's one thing. Notice I say it's multidimensional. Of course, it's physical. Okay. Puberty. And notice that puberty starts earlier than other generations. Puberty in 2020 starts much earlier than puberty in 1920. And the idea is it better healthcare? Is it better diet? So we don't know the exact cause, but obviously there's correlations. There's also the intellectual. Okay. And remember Piaget's formal reasoning stage. This is where a child or a human being, kind of as they transition into adolescence, their physical development, we always think, endocrine system and hormones, 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 but let's think neurologically. This is where the brain is going to change and allowing for the abstract reasoning. That's the hallmark of the formal reasoning stage. Okay. Emotion. The frontal lobe's ability to control the limbic system. Okay, so we know that emotion is chemical and physical, but I want you to think of it emotionally. When we all have emotions, and no one has 100% control of them, but during the adolescent stage, there is going to be an attunement where you have these strong emotions, these strong feelings, and eventually the rest of the brain is going to have to catch up, not stop it because emotions aren't bad, but steer it, control it, and mold it. Okay, social. And this is important. Everyone says, of course, teenagers need their social interaction. And they say it as an afterthought, as if that's more important than nutrition and sleep. The reality is, just as little children need cuddling and play, adolescents need to socially interact. It is just as critical for their neurological development as almost any other things. So if you're watching this and you're a teenager, remember that, and just keep that tucked away next time your parents tell you to get off the phone. Just say, you know what, it's critical for my neurological development. There, you can thank me for that one later. Okay, and financial. This is a psychological class, not a financial class, but I think it's important to know that this word protracted, look at this this word at the end of number 5. Adolescence gotten longer with each generation simply because as society gets more complex, it's much more difficult for young people to be completely independent. And you wonder if someone who's 22 years old, theoretically they're an adult, but if they're still living at mommy and daddy's house and they're still driving mommy and daddy's cars and living rent free, are they really an adult? And that's, more of a philosophical question. So adolescence is multidimensional. Okay. Let's look at G. Stanley Hall, one of the earliest American psychologists. And he coined the term that adolescence was a time of storm and stress. And that sounds ominous. And it sounds like teenagerhood is filled with this tumultuous idea of screaming and crying and emotions. And you know what? While there are ups and downs, just like there are in any points of life, the reality is maybe that's not true. Hollywood portrays teenagerness, if that's even a word, to portrays adolescence as this tumultuous idea, as Will Smith said, parents just don't understand. And you know what? The reality is most teens and most parents and most teachers in high schools actually get along pretty well. Most people are pretty well adjusted, but since that doesn't sell newspapers and that doesn't sell interesting Hollywood teen hijink movie plots, that's not what Hollywood portrays. So the reality is it's not necessarily a time of storm and stress. Interestingly, the concept of adolescence relatively new. For most of human history, adolescents were just smaller workers, but the idea is that becomes a separate phrase, earlier as society becomes more industrial. The word teenager didn't appear until the 1930s or 40s. It's hard to pin down. There's different sources saying exactly when it appeared, but it's an interesting idea. This is a new concept for most of human history, okay? Okay. Now we're looking at family conflict, and I hinted that Hollywood builds them up because that helps sell the narrative that teens and parents are like mortal enemies, like dogs and cats and things like that. And that's not what it is. If those of you who are watching, most of the time you get along with your parents. That doesn't mean you want to spend every minute of the day and you share every part of your life with them, but for the most part, you get along pretty well. Now, if we're all quarantined, that doesn't mean we're not kind of squabbling a little bit, and mostly that's because it's more of a roommate issue than it is adolescent adult issue. Okay, so when we talk about family conflicts, and I got this family conflicts here from the College Board's objective, this is what they want us to review and be aware of. Well, I hope College Board doesn't, turn this off and cancel and fire me, but we'd have to define what is a family conflict. Are we talking about the fact that someone didn't take out the recycling or unload the dishwasher on time? Or are we talking about a screaming match or something like that? So, we'd have to operationally define them, but even if we have conflicts, now conflicts sound scary, right? But no, they are good and necessary, especially within a family. It is especially important for a child and a teenager, whether they're 13 or 19, to be able to have a conflict. Because where else are they going to learn to deal with conflict? How to deal with their emotions, how to fight fair? Can you have a conflict and talk it out? Are you going to end up calling names? Are you going to have some of the silent treatment? Those things are skills that need to be learned. So conflict is important. It's not just something you deal with. It's something in many ways you should seek. You shouldn't run away from it, because how else would you get better at negotiating problems? Why are there conflicts? Well, let's use Piaget's term that schemas change. Well, if you're watching this, I would imagine your demographic is 16 years old. You are not the same person you were 13 when you were 13, completely different type of person. You think differently. Now, for you, those 3 years are huge. For your parents, those 3 years, they haven't really changed that much. So imagine their idea of you changes slower than your idea of yourself. And sometimes your parents need to say, whoa, well, maybe we should extend the curfew. Maybe we should give you more privileges and things like that. But on the flip side, of course, maybe there's more responsibilities too. So as parents and kids' idea of themselves change, there's going to be conflict. And that's, again, good. Two Piagetian words. And we didn't talk about that or on Friday when we were talking about Piaget. Assimilation is when something new happens and it doesn't really change you. So, for instance, if I just taught you a vocabulary word and you learned it, does your mind fundamentally change? I don't think so. I hope not. A vocabulary word shouldn't change who you are as a person. However, what if there's a new event, a new experience, a new development in your life that is so big it doesn't fit into your mind? Your mind has to change. And when you're a young child, that happens very frequently. Imagine the idea of a child being able to walk. That's a fundamental different, a shift. The child can now walk wherever they want. They can't just crawl. We're going up and down stairs. That's huge. So when you're 16 and you get your driver's license, that's huge. Your life fundamentally changes. Okay. Um, that's called accommodation. And so you can imagine a little bit of change doesn't just you assimilate that, no big deal. When you have a big change, you yourself and your parents must change, and sometimes people don't want to. So there might be the source of some conflict. Remember, we talked about parenting styles. So conflicts are going to come as a result, or not a result, but maybe intermingled, because result says causes, and we don't know what the exact cause of conflicts are because we haven't done an experiment. But we do know that parenting styles and parenting personalities are just a lot of variables. Okay, and I think I've talked it over. So we're going to move on from this slide. Just know that conflicts happen; they're necessary for the development of the teen. Okay, physical changes of adolescence. That's what everyone focuses on. That's probably what your health class was on. Um, phys- uh, Puberty is the physical representation of adolescence. That's what everyone sees, because you can't see social development, you can't see moral development, you can't see emotional development, and you can't see neurological development. So that's what everyone talks about, but that's only one small part of it. On average, of course, girls start puberty earlier, almost 2 years earlier than boys. Menarche is the first menstrual period. Spermarche is the first ejaculation. Now, depends on who you talk to. Some people are going to say that is the beginning of puberty. The reality is, if you talk to pediatricians, there's pre-adolescence. So nailing down an exact time of when puberty starts, it's kind of like saying that it's tough to say an exact moment or second in time. It's a process. Development isn't an event; it's a process. Primary sexual characteristics are traits related to reproduction. The enlargement of the sex organs, start to produce sperm, start to release an egg. Those are primary sex characteristics. Secondary sex characteristics, traits which don't necessarily have a direct physical reproductive process, perhaps growth of body hair, those kind of things. Okay, so we did physical. Let's look at the social aspects of adolescence. Social emotional skills become increasingly important. And again, because teachers and parents and old boomers like me, because we can't see them, we forget that social skills are just as important as nutrition, as sleep, as good grades and stuff like that to development of a child. So we look at the idea that these kind of skills need to be practiced frequently every day. And maybe every now and then, if you get into conflict with your friends where you move from one friend group to another, that's normal. Okay, it doesn't make it easy, doesn't make it not painful, but to some extent it's normal and necessary. Okay, I think this middle sentence right here is more of a duh, right? Adolescents become less dependent on parents, become more involved with their peers. Let's pay attention to this personal fable idea. Adolescents believe themselves to be unique and invincible. Okay, to some extent, that's patronizing. Not every teenager thinks they're invincible all the time. On the other hand, one of the best ways I could explain this is, and I hope this doesn't come out as offensive, but maybe you'll get the butt of the joke is, hey, what'd the adolescent boys say before we went to the emergency room? Hey, watch this. And so the idea is, there is risky behavior. It reaches a peak in adolescence. It doesn't mean all the time, for all kids. It just means that that does happen. Personal fable is a belief that adolescents have that maybe they're the star of their own kind of mental show and they're convinced everyone's watching them. I wonder how many teenagers freak out because they don't want to be seen repeating the same outfit 3 days after they just wore. Like, Mom, people are going to know. That's the idea of personal fable, that you think people are watching your life story. Imaginary audience is a thought that's common in adolescence. It's very similar to personal fable in that you believe everyone's looking at them because they're the center of their world. This is related to a social psychology concept called spotlight effect. While there are shades of difference between personal fable, imaginary audience, and spotlight effect, if you get the gist that in adolescence, not just adolescence, but it peaks in adolescence, that people think that they're being watched, that they're the most important, that they're kind of on a stage, and if you make a mistake, you look around to see if anyone saw. That's the idea. Okay, we're still on social aspect, and now we're moving on to the intellectual aspect. Remember that everything that is psychological is also and simultaneously biological. Okay, so if there's social development, that means that neurons developed and perhaps there's long-term potentiation. Okay, and here's the idea. If you go in a health class, they always say puberty occurs below the belt. Well, the reality is puberty occurs between the ears as well. What's happening in the frontal lobe, in the limbic system? We talked about sensation seeking, and sensation seeking, again, I don't want to say all adolescents are one way. That's like saying all males are one way, all females are one way. However, for the sake of this presentation, I have to speak in broad generalities, say adolescents are like that, but that's a little bit disingenuous. Having said my disclaimer, let's suggest that adolescents are much more interested in new experience and things that are adventurous. Generally, your grandmother does not really look forward to going on roller coasters. Okay. Why is that? Is it because her limbic system has slowly changed over decades? It's possible. So I use the idea that the limbic system, the metaphor is it's like a gas pedal. The limbic system says, let's go, let's do this. All right, we got things to do. And if you know what the hypothalamus is kind of the main driver of all of our primary urges. The prefrontal cortex says, if not stop, prefrontal cortex says, whoa, slow down. Maybe not right now. Let's think this through. Let's do this later. And so as the brain is growing, these two kind of opposing systems end up working together. And if you're confused about how these two things work together, I urge you to retake a look at Phineas Gage and what happens when his limbic system and his prefrontal cortex were perhaps separated. Okay. A big word you don't need to know, but I wanted to bring it in here, dopamine. Okay, so these two systems, if we're looking at the social aspects of adolescence, when you're really, really mad and you want to type out a message on your phone, right before you hit send, should your frontal lobe say, whoa, slow down, I know you're mad, but dopamine is your reward. It's your reward seeking or pleasure seeking chemical. So you can imagine it's kind of sourced in the limbic system. It says, let's go do this right now. And your prefrontal cortex needs to say, wait a minute, maybe that's not a good idea. And these are related to the social aspects of adolescence. Your urge to lash out and post something on social media might want to be kind of called back and restrained. Look at these two words, self-centeredness versus egocentrism. Well, we talked about egocentrism is the inability to take another person's point of view. Self-centeredness is sort of related to that, but it's perhaps more emotional rather than cognitive. A little child in egocentrism literally can't understand that someone else knows something that he doesn't, or doesn't know something that he does. Self-centeredness is perhaps more concerned that emotions of I don't want to say feeling sorry for yourself, but perhaps emotions are concerned with what's going on in you when your feelings right now overwhelm your ability to understand that other people are feeling something different. It's not all the time. It's not for only teenagers, but self-centeredness, if you want to be unkind, might be a little bit of perhaps emotional selfishness, emotional unawareness that other people are struggling to. Okay, we got to look at the key researchers in the idea of adolescence and throughout life. Okay, we did on Friday, we did Piaget and we did Baumrind, and we did a lot of people who looked at the different types of stages and categories that infants can fall in. Now we're looking at Erik Erikson's psychosocial theory. You'll notice that I highlighted psychosocial because Erikson's a neo-Freudian. Freud had a psychosexual develop, and anyone who's a neo-Freudian, they believe in the power of the unconscious. It's just that they don't believe in Freud's idea that everything's reducible down to an unconscious libidinous urge for sex or something like that. Erikson had 8 stages, and he believed in the power of the psychosocial development. And he's had a series of unconscious conflicts that we must resolve in order to progress throughout our lifespan. If we don't resolve them, perhaps we become fixated in an earlier time. Whereas Freud had 5 stages, Erikson has 8. And the difference is Erikson takes us all the way through towards the end of our lifespan. It doesn't just stop in childhood or adolescence. So let's take a look at some of these 8 things. I'm going to go quickly again because we just have too much content in just a little bit of time. So here we go. Pardon me if I speak quickly. Okay, I said we have 8 stages. Here's the first 2. And I'm assuming you've at least become familiar with these. So we have trust versus mistrust. And this is the idea is, does a baby who is helpless and oftentimes wakes up freezing, and not freezing, but it thinks it's freezing. It's cold, it's wet, it's dark, it's alone, and it's hungry in a crib, and it starts crying. Are its needs going to be met? When it falls down, is someone going to pick it up? When it's helpless, is it going to learn the world's a safe place? If yes, then we have trust. If the baby realizes throughout the first couple months and maybe even years of its life, it realizes its basic needs are rarely met or halfway met, and you know what, the world's a pretty scary place, well, then that's going to lead to the idea of mistrust. And it could be going back to the idea of attachment styles. And maybe this kind of early trauma or neglect might plant the seeds for, and I said maybe, okay, because you can't find a cause necessarily of mental illness, but it does kind of make sense. If the child's needs aren't met, how does that telescope out throughout someone's life? Okay, stage 2, autonomy versus shame and doubt. This is when the toddler's learning their body. The toddler's learning its own abilities. Okay, it's when it can walk, when it can talk. And this is potty training, starting the idea of potty training. Can it say, I'm in control here? Can a toddler run away from mommy? But it's interesting. A toddler's only going to run away from mommy if he knows that mommy will take him back. Okay, so that's the idea of trust. Not necessarily, but you can see these things are building on each other. You want to feel comfortable with saying to mommy no if you know that mommy will always be there to pick you up. And if you know toddlers and twos, the terrible twos and terrible threes, is this an early child's favorite word is no. Do you want snacks? No. Do you not want snacks? No. Are you tired? No. Do you want to go? And little kids like to say the word no because they're defining themselves as separate from mommy. Okay, shame and doubt. This is when the toddler's harshly punished, or criticized for, trying to be him or herself. They want to try new activities. And if they are not allowed to do so, then they kind of doubt that maybe they're worth doing it. Similar to the idea of shame and doubt is initiative and guilt. But maybe let's put this spin on it. If autonomy is all about their physical abilities, walking and talking and saying no and potty training, initiative versus guilt is the idea of cognitive. It's an imaginative play. Can the child think their own thoughts? Can they play their own way? Okay. And if you ever watch a 5-year-old sit down and have their action figures or Barbies, man, they're in their own world and they are playing and they're having a good time with us. Okay. However, if on the other hand they're not allowed to play their own way, then according to the idea of Erickson, they're going to develop this sense of guilt, the sense that what, maybe I shouldn't try something new. Maybe I shouldn't say, "Mommy, look what I drew." Stage 4. Okay, I want you to think of maybe elementary school. The idea school-age child is learning what he or she can and should do in relationship with rules, with structure. Can they return their homework? Can they write a full sentence? Can they line up quietly or sit on the little carpet during reading time? Socialization, taking your turn, raising your hand, impulse control, those things are important. Now, what if they aren't able? Okay, what if they're always the last one picked? What if they can't read on a certain reading level? And according to Erickson, unconsciously, and again, this is all unconscious, the child starts to get, well, if I can't do that, maybe I'm not as good as others. Okay. Stage 5, and this is adolescence again, is identity. Now, even the most introspective adolescent who's watching this right now, or who's recording it, who's watching the recording, you are aware that your mind is changing. You are aware that was what your favorite song or your favorite friend groups not too long ago was totally changed. That's a conscious level. This is on a deeper unconscious level. And even though you're aware you're probably going through it, you can't access your unconscious. And the idea is, who are you? And it's going to try out different things, and this is where you get the idea of, let me try this, it's not necessarily conscious, it's more unconscious. Now, if a child during the teen years doesn't figure out who they are, whatever that means, it's a very vague and abstract concept, especially when we say unconscious. But notice, identity, it's tough to figure out who you are if you don't have a strong sense of what you can do. Okay, so there's got the idea of scaffolding, and we're building on top of each idea. Okay, we're going to transition into adulthood, age 20 to 40 years, intimacy versus isolation. And for those of you who ever seen the show Friends, this is a perfect example of this. You have a bunch of young adults who do nothing but pretty much talk about their relationships and their love interest. Can they get a long-term mate? Okay, and this is the idea of intimacy. In the idea, Erickson wrote in a different time, but perhaps it still holds true in 2020 United States. The idea, there is an unconscious drive to date and find a mate. But remember, you can't find a mate and give yourself to someone if you don't know who you are, that you found in adolescence. You don't know who you are if you don't know. So these things again build on each other. So it's intimacy if you resolve it. Otherwise, it's isolation. That doesn't mean, in a horrible idea, you could get married even if you haven't resolved your earlier stages. And then the idea that you need to find out who you are in order to have a full pair bond. Okay. Generativity versus stagnation. Okay, teens, if you're watching this, every time your parent gives you static about what they consider as nonsense and you on your phone and they're hassling you, all right, now you want you to look at them. Respectful, I'm not trying to get you in trouble. The idea is, have you ever seen your parents obsess or do work that doesn't need to be done? And the idea is, maybe they have a particular way they want to clean their house or take care of their yard. Maybe they have a particular affinity for how they want to create something, whether it's a family, a career, a legacy. At their age, they're trying to build something. They don't know why any more than you know why you care about people that you really shouldn't care about their opinion, but you do. So remember, this is all unconscious. So folks, in my age and or your parents are all about trying to build something, create something, including a family, which is why sometimes your parents seem to obsess over little things that you do when you're like, Mom, what's the big deal? Why? They can't understand it because it's unconscious. Okay, stagnation. If the adult does not feel productive during this period, they're going to become fixated and they won't kind of feel like they measure up to what society says. Stage 8, ego integrity. The senior citizen reflects on life to determine if it was worth living. The idea to look back and say, you know what, it was worth it. All the struggles, I feel good about myself. I put myself in a position, it was great. And then, the other idea would be what's called ego despair or just despair. Seniors who do not feel like they've developed a productive life may feel unsatisfied. Okay, Erickson's 8 stages. I know I went through them fast. If you didn't get through all of that, I urge you to check your textbook on that. Just as we did Erickson and his stage theories, remember I talked about on Friday the idea of continuity means there's no stage, people grow smoothly. Discontinuity means stage theory. Well, Erickson was a social stage theorist. Now we're going to look at Kohlberg's idea. So Kohlberg is a moral stage theorist. What's interesting about Kohlberg is it's not directly tied to age. Okay, we develop morally perhaps a little bit more haphazardly. There's not a direct timeline. It says, oh, a 7-year-old now develops this way. Let's talk about the Heinz dilemma super quick. The Heinz dilemma is the idea that Heinz was a man whose wife was sick, and it's been told a lot of different ways, but here's the gist. His wife is sick and dying. Should he steal the money or steal the medicine, money to buy the medicine? Should he steal in order to save his wife's life? Now, many of you are like, well, of course. But let me caution you, it's not what your answer is. It's how you justify it. Aha. And that brings up the idea of an adolescent's relatively new ability to reason abstractly, to think why in higher moral terms. Let's go through Kohlberg's 3 stages. Okay. And one more time, it's not about what you say, it's about why you say it that's going to kind of land you in his ideas. Okay. Kohlberg had 3. The pre-conventional is the idea of based on consequence, meaning it would be wrong to steal. So Kohlberg shouldn't, or Heinz shouldn't steal because he will get in trouble. And that's what a 2-year-old said, don't steal because you get in trouble. That's the highest they can do. Or maybe based on self-interest, Heinz should steal because his wife will owe him a favor. That's a little bit shaky right there. And let's hope that we're all not here. So let's look at the conventional level here. The idea with Heinz is Heinz should steal because a good husband would do that. You take care of your wife. That's what a good husband does. And that's kind of based on the idea of conforming to the role of a husband. Or based on social order, Heinz should not steal because what if everyone did that? Oh, then we'd have social chaos. We shouldn't. So which is the right answer? And according to the conventional, there's a yes and or no. Post-conventional. Okay. And this is more based on universal ethical principles. And I want you, if you're taking notes, I would like you to maybe somehow or another write down or jot down the idea of the highest level of, you remember Maslow's hierarchy of needs, self-actualization. These 2 terms are a little bit related. You can make a connection between Heinz should steal, but also accept the consequences. And some of our, greatest civil rights leaders, they broke the law. Okay, and they accepted the consequences, or they went even beyond that. Heinz should steal because every human life is worth more than laws, medicine, or money. Okay, and so that's the idea that it's okay to break the law even if you get thrown in jail or become what's called a career criminal because you're serving a higher order. So those are those are Kohlberg's 3 levels. Okay. Now we're going on to moral competence, but what you're going to see here is related back. Remember, I talked about intelligence and the idea of emotional intelligence. We're going to look at some of the cues for emotional intelligence of Daniel Goleman. One of them is going to be impulse control, the ability to not lash out when you're mad or to steal when you want. Okay. And this is the ability of the conscious mind, which is kind of housed in the frontal lobe to, again, a frontal lobe limbic system dichotomy here. Another one is delayed gratification. When you're really mad or you're hurting emotionally, can you tell yourself, no, not right now. I'm going to solve it a different way, or maybe I'll address the situation when I'm a little bit more calm. Okay. And that's delayed gratification. Theory of mind is the idea that, you know what, other people, when they hurt you, let's find their point of view before you react. So that's kind of the idea of what's called theory of mind, which we said is the exact opposite of egocentrism. And then emotional connection to the feelings and suffering of others. Remember, when somebody hurts you, it's probably not about necessarily what's going on with you. Find out why, when hurt begets hurt, you get the idea. Okay, let's characterize the development of decisions as related to intimacy. That's a really long-winded idea the College Board wants us to hit as this objective. And we're looking at intimacy. And you're like, well, why does that fit into psychology? Well, think about it. Human beings are social creatures. It's more than social creatures where we run out and on a playground and play a game together. I'm just not talking about that. We need deep connected, emotional, and intimate bonds. That's going to build trust. Okay. So adolescence, I'm sorry, let's start on even elementary school children. Even elementary school children have crushes. And to some extent, we're like, oh, that's so cute. A little third grader passes each other notes, boyfriend, girlfriend, it's all completely innocent. So I think that shows that it's almost separate. It can be separate from the concept of puberty. And intimacy doesn't have to be sexual in nature. But when we do get to adolescence, it is important to note early sexual activity is related to a host of multidimensional problems. Now, time out, time out, time out. We're going to have to operationally define what is early, what is sexual activity. I mean, we're talking holding hands, you get the idea? And, a host of multidimensional problems. It just basically means that I'm not going to, I'm not going to over explain that one. Let's jump on to early adulthood. Let's look at Erickson's stage. Erickson's stage of early adulthood is intimacy, where someone and Erickson's dates and ages might be a little bit off. He said 20s to 40s or 20s to 30s or something like that. But as a child transitions out of adolescence, their drive to find an intimate and perhaps sexual partner is an unconscious thing that's very hard to resist. It's not even you want to resist it because you want that so badly. It starts in adolescence, boyfriend, girlfriend, and perhaps those are kind of practices or trial runs for a wife or a spouse or a husband. Okay. Middle adulthood is the idea of concern with money and job. Well, that's going to get in the way of intimacy. That's going to get in the way of opening yourself up to become connected, yes, physically and sexually, but emotionally too. Because if you're so concerned or distracted with something external, you might not be developing your internal relationships. So when we're looking, if intimacy is so important to human beings, we're looking at it as people age. Even early elementary school children show a desire for intimacy, even if it's a cute, non-sexual way, best friends concept. Adolescence, that's the idea of social, emotional, and physical. It does start early adult, Erickson, middle adulthood, and then we get to late adulthood myth busting. Let's do this. The stereotype is with older folks, there's either a physical inability to enjoy physical intimacy, sexuality, and or lack of desire. Well, the reality is that's not necessarily true. um, Society and data has shown, longitudinal data have shown that people who are retired or empty nesters are very intimate and very active with each other. And maybe that's kind of, once you get the stress out of the way of building your family, you can kind of reconnect. Now, one of the things that we got to talk about is describe how sex and gender influence socialization and other aspects of development. Biggest question in the world, ready? We got to operationally define our terms. What makes a male or female? Now, I have a quick chart. Is it that when we know that males have estrogen and females have testosterone, so we all have we all have the hormones, male and female hormones in our body. But males have a different ratio. So what makes male or female? Imagine that you had all of the checks in the male boxes except one in the female box. Are you still male? What if you had an equal equal? What is it that makes a male or female? What if you had the external genitals of a male, but you still had a uterus or fallopian tubes? You see, it's not as easy. It's not going to be a binary situation. So, having said all that, look at this bullet point. I find this fascinating. So much research has been trying to figure out what is the difference between men and women. That's the wrong question to ask, because we have so many commonalities. The idea here is that men and women are far more related, far more connected and similar than they are different. And so if you think about it, men and women have same heart, same lungs, and yes, there are different brain structures, or the structures are slightly different. The reality is the brain of men and women are very, very similar. However, during adolescence, it is important to note it is a time of exaggerated gender behavior. Rarely are you going to hear 50-year-old men talk about how much they can bench press. Okay. And oftentimes, as women get older, they become a little bit less concerned with, I guess, ideas of attractiveness, makeup, styles, and maybe social connectedness. So boys seem to be worried about physical prowess and following sports teams and quoting stats, and girls seem to be a little bit more concerned with social interaction and physical attractiveness. And that, that generally declines throughout the ages. Okay, couple vocabulary words, 6 of them to be complete. Okay, sex is a binary thing generally. However, you can imagine there are people who are born with both sets of genitals, and then therein lies an interesting question: what is sex? What is male or female? But to make things simple today, we've got sex is the biological difference, gender behavior patterns. Okay, and oftentimes those behavior patterns are defined socially. Okay, not necessarily by the family, not necessarily by the individual, but the society says this is male, this is female. Androgyny is showing both female and male characteristics. Gender identity is how a person thinks of themselves. Most of the time, your sex, your gender, and your gender identity line up together. But as we saw in the chart, what if they don't line up perfectly? You can imagine that causes a fair amount of discomfort when you're going through the adolescent stage of who am I? Okay. Gender expression, how you demonstrate your gender-based behavior. So if you identify and you are, physically your sex is a male and you identify as a male, how do you show it? That would be gender expression. And then social learning theory, go back to the idea of Bandura's idea of a child watching a model and then imitating. Okay, so where do we learn our gender roles? And of course, society shows us that. And then, of course, one of the things we have to be aware of in the next couple slides is that sometimes society doesn't give us healthy ideas of what it is to be male or female. Oftentimes, what we see in Hollywood or on different websites is an exaggerated idea that males need to be, hugely muscular and violent and emotionally closed off, and females need to, kind of be more of a submissive idea who their whole goal is to look pretty and be, a co-star, not necessarily the main part of the movie. Okay, similar to that, how are boys and girls raised? I find it interesting that even before many of us are born, our parents and grandparents have bought outfits for us, picked out gender-based names, have dreamed of what will before they've met us. They've already kind of, put us in on a certain trajectory of what they want us to be. And that's, it's like, nature versus nurture. That's pre-nurture. Before we're born, they've decided this. It's important to note the Joan-John experiment. This is a tragic experiment. It's called the forbidden experiment. And the idea is you take, and here's a word you need to know, monozygotic twins or identical twins, one zygote, sperm hits egg, one zygote within the first 2 weeks. That splits. You have two. Now you're going to have two zygotes that form into embryos, form into fetuses, right? Two identical twins. One of them underwent a tragic accident during the circumcision in their first, I think it was year of life. His penis was damaged. Penis was amputated. And then so the question is, what are the parents going to do? They were horribly distraught, as you can imagine. It's different than having your little pinky amputated. You can imagine that's a pretty big marker of who you are as a person, your genitals. So at the exact same time, there happened to be, it's almost a miraculous coincidence. There was a researcher or theoretician, Dr. Money. He had an idea that guess what? Who we are gender-wise is just a social construct. We're born tabula rasa. There's no difference between boys and girls. It's how we're raised. The parents who had need of a solution and the theorists who had need of research subjects, they got together. And the idea was raise the little boy who was a baby who had this horrible traumatic accident to his genitals, raise him as a girl. He'll never know the difference. And then if you raise him as a girl and socialize him as a girl, that would therefore prove that gender is a social construct. Well, it ended horribly. Gender is definitely biological. Sex is definitely biological. Gender expression is biological. So it is nature and nurture. However, it's important to know that's what's called a forbidden experiment. You just can't take two identical twins and experiment, put one in a control group, one in an experimental group. I think we know that. That wasn't done on purpose. It was done kind of after the fact, after the incident happened. Instinctive drift. You'll remember we talked about the idea of if you classically condition a coyote to throw up at the smell of sheep meat, the coyote will eventually avoid the sheep meat. Here's my question. How long will that go on? Because coyotes are natural predators of sheep. I don't think it's going to go on very long. Eventually, the coyote will get over its fear of throwing up and nausea and start eating sheep again. That's called instinctive drift. And I think we saw that if you are familiar with what's called David Reimer, who was a gentleman who had that happen to him. Even though his parents were raising him as a girl, he still demonstrated masculine and what's called boy characteristics. He wanted to play with boy toys, even though his parents tried to steer him. So maybe it's not, not just, no, maybe about it. It's not just nurture, it's also biological. Okay. Now we're looking at the idea of physical and cognitive changes that emerge through the lifespan. It's interesting, females live about 5 years longer than men. Okay. And it's a fact. And it's a tragic fact. There is going to be slowing of cell replacement, muscle mass, neurotissue. But aging happens, and it happens slowly. And if you're a teenager watching this, you're convinced it's not going to happen to you. And you know what? I hope it doesn't. But it's interesting. This is something we can't get away from. Okay, so I should put a frowny face here because I have a smiley face here. Um, for instance, age-related damage to the senses might be the first thing to notice. I wonder if your parents, when they have to have their reading glasses on to read something and go way back like that, or maybe your parents don't hear as well when we talked about the hearing tests where teenagers can hear high-pitched noise, but adults can't. Inner ear, your vestibular system, if that starts to kind of deteriorate, maybe that's why old folks have struggle and fall so much. Okay. None of us have perfect control over our bodies, organs, and brain. They're going to deteriorate according to a relatively predictive pattern. Remember, maturationism means the body is going to grow a certain way in a certain order, and there's going to be the flip side of that, the body is going to deteriorate. However, that can be slowed and slowed greatly. There are 80-year-olds who are running marathons. There are 80 and 90-year-olds who still get up and go to work and they live happy and healthy. So the idea is, remember, it's the idea of use it or lose it. Okay. The challenge is the challenge is to seek challenge, find out what's difficult and do that. That's what keeps your brain and body healthy and active. We call that word neurogenesis. Neurogenesis is the idea your brain can grow new neurons. For eons and for most of psychology and neurology, we thought that's it. You're born with all the neurons you're ever going to get. That's not necessarily true. The brain can grow new neurons and the brain can grow new synaptic connections. That generally only happens when you're challenged, when you're learning something new, and that's how you keep it's how you keep the body and the brain fresh. Remember, we talked about crystallized and fluid intelligence. Crystallized intelligence is the ability to think, reason, and problem solve using experience and accumulated problem solving strategies that we call heuristics. So, as a person might become a little bit cognitively slower as they age, and that decline is slow. I'm not going to say it's reversible, but you can slow it and even plateau it and flatten it out with, repeated use of problem solving strategies, keeping the brain active, keeping the body active. And that, of course, also means nature versus nurture. Some of us have the genes to age and live a long time. Some of us don't. But even those who have genetic instructions of when our bodies will stop repairing themselves, that can, of course, be delayed. So you got nature and nurture. Nurture is how you take care of yourself as you age. Like I said, the fact that that loss can be slowed, use it or lose it, and we talked about neurogenesis. Okay. What's important down here is personality is going to be a factor. Personality is, and we'll get into that, or we have gotten into the idea of personality of how open to you are changes. How do you deal with stress? Maybe you've heard of type A or type B personality. So personality is going to play a factor and how you age. Lifestyle is going to play a factor, not just what you eat, what you sleep, how you live, how you surround yourself with. And another word we're going to talk about is explanatory style. And this is the idea that over a lifetime, if you look at bad things that happen to you as challenges and opportunities instead of tragedies, this is the idea of how one aspect of how one might age gracefully. So it's not just nature, it's not just nurture, it's also psychological and emotional. How do you deal with yourself, with others, with life challenges over decades might predict how healthy and happy you're going to live. Now, what is good for the heart is good for the brain. The brain is a ridiculous, what we call vascular organ. I think it has several hundred, maybe 300 or 400 miles of blood vessels in it. That's the estimate. I don't think anyone's counted that. So, if the brain has so many blood vessels and so dependent on blood pumping, then we can think of it as we can think of the heart, which means exercise, which means a proper diet and exercise and sleep. So, what does this mean? This means that as the human body and the brain as part of the body grows and to some extent changes, and I hate to use the word deteriorates, there are things we can do to mitigate that. Okay, let's look at late adulthood, what I call myth busting. There's the idea of the midlife crisis that gentlemen, perhaps in their 40s, go through and they maybe leave their wife for a younger woman and go buy a sports car. And guess what? The data isn't there. It just doesn't show that the midlife crisis kind of exists. Of course, we could find one example in 100, but I think that's going to be either the anchoring bias or availability heuristic. And the idea that senior citizens, and one of my favorite shows is The Simpsons, and they unfortunately portray the character of Homer Simpson's father as grumpy and befuddled and helpless, and just everything that's wrong with being a little bit old. And that's not the way the data shows. Most senior citizens are happy. They are usually have a well-connected friend group. They might be financially independent, and so the reality is they're living their best life. But that's not the stereotype or the narrative that's shown to us. So the stereotypes of poor health, inactivity, that's not right. Believe me, I'm not saying there aren't folks who are struggling. Um, but we have to take that in context because we can't say all people of a certain age group are one thing. Okay, as I just said, reality, most people are healthy, active, and self sufficient. And we know this because of cross sectional studies and longitudinal studies. I put these in here to remind you of the important in the AP psychology exam. They're going to ask you quite a bit about research questions and research methods. Okay, I put this in here because of the importance of knowing what an operational definition is. How are you going to define living well? How are you going to define physical competence and or incompetence? How would you define a senior citizen? Again, this is the word that you're probably going to see on the AP psychology exam. You should be able to talk about how can you take an abstract concept such as development or aging and take it into something measurable. Okay, as we kind of hinted at, as folks get older, there are problems that evolve. There are problems that come about. The broad category is called a neurocognitive disorder. It's in the DSM-5. And in this chapter, and Mrs. Fenton talked about that a little bit way back a couple weeks ago when we started. In this chapter, what we want to talk about is what used to be called dementia is now categorized under the neurocognitive disorders category. Now, one way that one can kind of delay this and or slow its advance is by social interaction. It kind of makes sense. The more you do, the more your brain does and recovers and grows and challenges. Social interaction, cognitive interaction, emotional interaction, these things are very important. Similarly, physical health. So what's good for the brain or what's good for the heart is good for the brain. Constant exercise, good food, good sleep. These are the three pillars of good health. And they kind of go on into the idea of go on into health. Oh, sorry, got distracted by a message coming in. Okay, Alzheimer's disease is rare, but it's unfortunately the face of aging. This when people think, well, what do you think of senior citizens? Unfortunately, the availability heuristic pops in, and you think of someone who is cognitively and physically very slow, not very capable. That's not necessarily true. I think the rate for Alzheimer's is maybe 3 or 4%. However, it can be a terrible and terrifying disease. The thing that we know, and we don't know too much about it, the research hasn't yet found a consistent or demonstrable treatment for it, is there seems to be a disruption with the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. Okay, it starts gradual and may go undiagnosed. It may start as you forget your keys, but we all do that. Once you start exhibiting a pattern of this, then you're going to see other cognitive deficiencies as well. Okay, I've talked about this slide quite a bit, the idea of what can we do to maximize function as we get older, and basically exercise, sleep, and diet, social interaction. Anything that can cross the blood-brain barrier is going to, of course, affect the brain over the long term. So you want to reduce chemicals such as drugs and alcohol. Remember, the brain is a plastic organ. It will grow. And so the more you challenge it, and we talked about mental health, take care of yourself as far as stress. If you have long-term stress, that might have kind of echoes and repercussions later in life. And then the idea of positive psychology is, you don't want to just not be sick. You want to seek out and live your best life. How do you do that? Okay, let's talk about the AP exam practice. We're back with the Schmidlap family. Mrs. Schmidlap is an experienced AP psychology teacher. She knows that her bright and caring students sometimes do things that make teaching them difficult. Please explain how the following terms might make teaching teenagers difficult. You should present a cogent argument based on your critical analysis of the question posed using appropriate psychological terminology. It is not enough to answer the question by merely listing facts. Okay, I gave you 4 words here. You want to, again, the question isn't just define and apply. You want to explain how do these things make teaching teenagers difficult. Okay, looking at the time, we're going to get to these slides later. There is, I want you to explore AP Classroom. They've opened it up and added a couple different features about how to get some extra practice. And maybe submit that to your teacher. Unfortunately, we got to move on, and I will promise to kind of make sure we hit this on Monday, or Mrs. Fenton's up tomorrow on Tuesday. One last announcement I want to tell you guys about. Remember that next Friday on May 8th, we have 2 special guests, Dr. Claude Steele, who's very well known for the stereotype threat, as well as other things. He'll be joining us. And Dr. Elizabeth Loftus, who's very well known for her work in eyewitness testimony and how memory functions and does not function, will also be joining us next Friday, the 8th. Thanks for watching. We hope you'll join us again. Be sure to complete the practice question. We'll review the answer in the next lesson.